The first time Daniel Hayes saw the alien flagship up close, he understood why so many world leaders had trouble sleeping. Because the ship did not look like something built for peace, it looked like a silent god hanging above Earth, wide as a continent and dark as deep space, with blue lines of light running across its surface like veins, and inside that ship, in a chamber made of silver metal and transparent walls. The future of two civilizations was about to change. Daniel was not a soldier or a famous diplomat. He was only a systems engineer chosen because he understood patterns in alien code. He was the kind of man who fixed broken machines, not broken politics. Yet there he stood among generals and ministers, wearing a simple black suit that felt too tight around his neck. Try not to stare at the alien guards whose armor looked grown rather than built, their tall bodies still as statues. Their glowing eyes watching every human movement carefully. The air inside the chamber felt heavy, not because of gravity, but because of fear. Humans had only known the Valar Empire for 6 months, and in that short time, they had learned one clear fact. The Valar were stronger, faster, and far more advanced. They did not need Earth. Earth needed them. And today, it was the first formal cultural exchange ceremony, a moment meant to prove that humans were worthy of peaceful contact. The doors at the far end of the hall opened without sound, and every whisper died instantly, lady. Valrine entered the chamber like a moving shadow of silver light. She was taller than any human present, her long dark hair falling behind her armored shoulders, her skin pale with faint blue patterns glowing softly across her arms. She did not smile. She did not look impressed. She simply walked forward with calm authority, and even the alien guards lowered their heads slightly as she passed. Daniel felt his heart beating faster because he knew from briefings that she was not just a commander. She was royal blood, daughter of the High Sovereign, which meant every word she spoke could shape history. The human ambassador began a prepared speech about unity and cooperation. His voice shaking only a little, the translator devices hovering between the two groups repeated each sentence in perfect alien tones. For several minutes, everything went smoothly, until the ambassador made an awkward attempt at humor about how humans and aliens might one day become one big family. The joke landed badly. The alien delegates did not react, their silence heavy and confusing. Daniel felt the tension growing, the kind that makes people say something stupid just to break it. And that was exactly what he did, leaning slightly toward his small translation pad. He muttered under his breath, "If it makes peace easier, I could just marry her." He meant it as sarcasm, a quiet comment no one would take seriously, a nervous release of pressure, but the translation pad did not understand. Sarcasm. It projected his words clearly across the chamber in the alien language, the sound echoing against metal walls for one long second. Nothing happened. Then every alien in the room froze, their glowing eyes turning toward him at the same time. Daniel felt cold, as if the air had suddenly disappeared. Lady Valrine stopped walking, her head turning slowly toward the human engineer who now wished he could disappear into the floor. She studied him with unreadable eyes. Then she stepped forward, each step calm and deliberate. Human security officers shifted nervously, unsure whether to intervene. Daniel's mouth opened to apologize, but no words came out. She stopped only 2 steps away from him. And then something impossible happened. The alien commander lowered herself to one knee, her head bowing deeply before him. A movement so graceful and serious that it felt like gravity itself had changed direction. Gasps filled the human side of the hall. Alien whispers rose in shock. And in a clear, steady voice, she said, "I accept. I wanted you too, human." The chamber exploded into confusion. Translators struggling to keep up as humans began asking what this meant. Daniel's brain refused to process the scene in front of him, because according to every cultural file he had read, the Valar only bowed in 2 situations, before their sovereign or before the one they chose as life partner. It was not a greeting, not a polite gesture. It was a declaration, and she had just made it publicly. The ambassador's face had turned pale. Alien nobles exchanged intense looks. And somewhere in the upper gallery, recording drones captured every second for both civilizations to see. Daniel finally found his voice and whispered. It was a joke, But the words felt weak and small in a room that had already changed forever. Lady Veilrine lifted her head and looked directly into his eyes. And there was no confusion in her expression, only certainty, as if she had been waiting for this moment long before he ever spoke. And in that terrifying silence, Daniel understood something much worse than a diplomatic mistake. This was not an accident to her. This was a choice, and somewhere beyond the transparent walls of the chamber, Earth turned quietly beneath a ship powerful enough to destroy it. Unaware that one careless sentence from an ordinary human engineer might have just tied the fate of two species together. And if you want to see what happens next in this story of humans facing something far bigger than themselves, make sure to subscribe to this channel, because this was only the beginning, and Daniel Hayes had no idea that his joke had just placed him at the center of an empire and possibly at the edge of war. When the noise inside the chamber finally began to fade, Daniel realized that no one was looking at the ambassador anymore. No one was looking at the generals or the cameras or even at Earth glowing below the glass walls. Every eye was fixed on him and the kneeling alien commander before him. And the silence that followed felt heavier than the entire alien warship surrounding them. Lady Veilrine slowly rose to her full height, her movements calm and controlled, as if nothing unusual had happened, but the reaction around her said otherwise. Several alien nobles stood abruptly from their elevated seats, their armor plates shifting in sharp metallic sounds. One of them spoke rapidly in the alien tongue, his voice carrying clear anger, even without translation. The hovering translator drone struggled to keep up, finally projecting the meaning in a flat, mechanical voice. The bond declaration has been witnessed. The word struck Daniel like physical force. Bond declaration, not proposal, not suggestion, declaration. Something official, something ancient. Two alien guards approached him, not aggressively, but with visible purpose. And though his first instinct was to step back, he forced himself to stand still, because running would only make everything worse. On the human side, panic was spreading quietly, advisors whispering urgently, security officers touching weapons they knew would be useless inside this ship. The ambassador demanded clarification, his voice thin, with tension, and the alien High Chancellor answered in a cold, steady tone, explaining that in Valar culture, a public bow from a royal bloodline individual was irreversible under sacred law unless formally rejected by the chosen partner within the same ceremonial gathering. If rejected, the act would be considered a humiliation not only to the individual, but to the royal lineage itself. And humiliation among the Valar was not settled with apologies, it was settled with force. Daniel's mouth went dry, because now he understood the trap forming around him. If he said no, it could mean war. If he said yes, it could mean becoming part of an alien empire he barely understood. Lady Veilrine turned to face the council, her voice calm but firm as she spoke in her own language, the translation echoing seconds later. The human spoke with courage before fear. That is strength. I have observed their species. They endure beyond reason. They survive what should destroy them. I choose them not as weakness, but as alignment. Her words created new waves of whispering. Daniel stared at her, trying to understand whether this was political strategy or something deeply personal. Because her expression did not look calculated, it looked certain. The High Chancellor then addressed Daniel directly, explaining that acceptance of the bond would elevate humanity's diplomatic status immediately to allied species, granting protection, shared technology pathways, and equal voice in interstellar councils, something Earth had hoped to achieve over decades. And yet it now stood balanced on the response of one nervous engineer who had made a sarcastic comment less than 5 minutes ago. But rejection would activate a right of honor challenge, allowing offended nobles to demand compensation for insult, which could escalate beyond diplomacy. Daniel felt the weight of billions of human lives pressing down on his shoulders. And for the first time, he truly grasped how fragile peace was between species that did not fully understand each other. He leaned slightly toward the ambassador, whispering urgently that it had been a misunderstanding, but the ambassador's face showed a painful truth. Misunderstanding did not matter anymore. What mattered was perception, and perception among the Valar was law. Meanwhile, across the chamber, several noble figures were studying Daniel not with anger now, but with calculation, as if measuring him for something larger than embarrassment. Because if this bond stood, it would shift power structures inside the empire itself. A human connected to the royal bloodline would introduce unpredictable influence, and unpredictability was something ancient empires feared more than enemies. Lady Veilrine stepped closer to Daniel again. Lowering her voice so only nearby translators could pick it up, she told him quietly that she had followed human transmissions for years before official contact, that she had studied their wars, their art, their music, their ability to argue and still remain united when facing extinction threats. She admitted that many in her empire believed humans were fragile and divided. But she saw something different. She saw a species that refused to surrender even when logic demanded it. And that defiance fascinated her. Daniel struggled to respond because this sounded less like political manipulation and more like personal admiration. But how could she truly know him? He was not humanity's best warrior or leader. He was just someone who fixed systems and solved problems. Yet maybe that was exactly what she respected, adaptability over dominance. As their quiet exchange ended, the High Chancellor announced that by ancient rule, Daniel must answer before the ceremony closed. The clock above the chamber began projecting a slow descending light pattern marking the ritual's remaining time, each pulse amplifying the tension in the room. On Earth, millions were already watching the live broadcast, social feeds, exploding with confusion and shock, some calling Daniel a hero, others accusing him of risking everything with foolish humor. And inside the alien hall, a different storm was forming. Several nobles openly opposed the bond, their glowing patterns shifting darker in visible agitation. One of them declared that a human could never stand beside royal blood without proving worth. And though no weapons were drawn, the atmosphere felt closer to battle than diplomacy. Daniel realized that whatever he chose would not end this. It would only begin something far larger. Lady Veilrine met his eyes again, and for the first time, he noticed a small detail others might have missed. Beneath her calm posture, there was vulnerability. Not fear of rejection, but fear that this moment might close a bridge she had hoped to build long before stepping into this chamber, and in that suspended silence between two civilizations. Daniel Hayes understood that his next word would not just define his future. It would define whether humanity stepped forward into the stars as partners or remained small beneath the shadow of a far stronger empire. And the descending ritual light continued to pulse, counting down toward a decision that could not be undone. The moment Daniel spoke the single word, "I accept," the chamber did not erupt with celebration. It tightened like a sealed container under pressure. Because acceptance did not calm the situation, it transformed it. The ritual lights above shifted from white to deep violet, signaling that the bond declaration had been sealed under witness. And across two civilizations, the shockwave spread instantly. On Earth, the news channels cut regular programming. Analysts argued loudly about consequences. They did not understand. Some governments praised Daniel for securing alliance status in seconds. Others accused him of surrendering human independence without negotiation. Protests began in major cities, not violent but loud and uncertain, because humanity had not voted on becoming family with an alien empire. And now, one ordinary engineer had stepped into a position no election had prepared him for. Meanwhile, inside the Valor flagship, the reaction was colder and far more dangerous. Noble houses gathered in private communication clusters, their voices sharp with disbelief. For centuries, the royal line had bonded only within carefully arranged power structures, strengthening alliances between dominant houses, never outside the species, never with a civilization considered militarily inferior. And yet Lady Veilrine had acted without council approval, invoking ancient sovereign rights that could not be legally overturned, which meant her decision was not illegal. It was disruptive. And disruption in a rigid empire was often more explosive than rebellion. Daniel was escorted not to a prison, but to royal quarters, a silent statement that his status had already shifted. Human security demanded access, but were denied under polite diplomatic language. The message was clear. He was now under Valor protection, and protection meant ownership in the eyes of some nobles. Whispers began suggesting that the bond was a strategic manipulation by the royal family to bypass council. Resistance and fast-track human integration. Others feared something even deeper. Because the Valar Empire was powerful but not stable, outer territories had shown signs of unrest. Trade disputes were increasing, and some military leaders believed expansion was necessary to maintain control. Bringing humans into the Empire could either stabilize that future or fracture it completely. And at the center of this growing storm stood Daniel, sitting alone in a room with walls made of living metal that responded to his heartbeat. Realizing he had crossed an invisible line between citizen and symbol, Lady Vaelrine entered without escort. Her posture still calm, but her glowing patterns slightly dimmer than before, a sign of internal strain among her kind. She explained that several high nobles had already filed formal protest claims, demanding a trial of worth to test Daniel's legitimacy. Not because the law required it, but because tradition demanded proof of strength when power shifted. Unexpectedly, she admitted that she expected resistance, but not this quickly and not this organized, which meant something else was moving beneath the surface. A coordinated faction that had been waiting for opportunity. Daniel asked the question no one else dared to voice, whether she truly chose him for who he was or for what humanity represented politically. And for a long second she said nothing. Then she answered with honesty that cut through the tension. She had studied humanity because her empire needed change, not conquest. She believed strength without adaptation led to collapse. And humans were unpredictable, creative, emotionally resilient. Everything her people suppressed in pursuit of control. But she also admitted that choosing him specifically had been instinct, something in the way he joked under pressure, the way he stood frozen yet did not deny his words immediately, something she interpreted as courage instead of fear. And that instinct had overridden calculation. Outside the room, reports arrived that several Outer Fleet commanders were repositioning ships without council authorization. Officially routine maneuvers. Unofficially a show of force. Earth detected the movements and raised defensive readiness levels. The fragile line between alliance and war thinning by the hour. Political commentators on both sides began framing the bond not as romance, but as leverage, asking whether humanity had just gained protection or lost sovereignty. And within the Valar capital world, massive public forums lit up with debate, younger citizens expressing curiosity about humans, older elites warning of contamination and dilution of pure lineage. The Empire had not faced cultural uncertainty in centuries, and uncertainty breeds fear. By the second day after the declaration, an influential warlord named Zyron Kale publicly addressed the High Council, questioning whether royal authority should remain unchecked in matters that affected the Empire's future. Stability. His speech carefully respectful, yet clearly provocative, suggesting that a species that had barely left its own star system could not comprehend the weight of imperial responsibility. And though he never directly insulted Daniel, the implication was clear: a human was not worthy to stand beside royal blood without proving himself in more than words. The council did not immediately respond, but the silence itself was permission for tension to grow. Daniel watched the broadcast replay. Inside his quarters, understanding that he was no longer just a man who made a mistake, he was now the focal point of a political earthquake. And the aftershocks were only beginning, because alliances built too quickly can crack under pressure, and empires do not change direction without resistance, especially when pride is involved. And somewhere deep within the Valar command structure, beyond public speeches and ceremonial law, quiet messages were being exchanged between ships and noble houses, messages that did not speak of diplomacy, but of contingency. And as Earth's defense satellites rotated silently in orbit and alien fleets adjusted formation patterns at the edge of detection range, it became clear that Daniel's acceptance had not ended the crisis. It had ignited a storm that would test not only his worth, but the stability of two civilizations standing on the edge of a future neither fully controlled. The announcement of the trial of worth did not come with shouting or dramatic threats. It arrived quietly through official channels, sealed with ancient authority marks that even the royal family could not ignore. And when Daniel read the translated decree, his stomach tightened, because the language was calm, almost respectful, yet every line carried the weight of danger. The trial would take place on Nareth 9, a remote training moon used by Valor elite warriors to test survival instincts under extreme conditions. Its surface covered in jagged black forests, toxic mist valleys, and engineered predators designed to simulate war environments. Daniel would be given basic survival tools but no advanced weapons, no armor, no external communication. He would have 48 standard hours to survive, and survival did not mean hiding in a cave. It meant navigating toward a designated extraction point while hunted by creatures built to track heat, sound, and fear responses. If he failed, the bond would be declared spiritually invalid under warrior tradition. And if he died, the council would call it tragic but honorable, a test that proved humanity was not ready. Lady Vaelrine argued fiercely in private sessions, insisting that the bond required no such validation. But the political pressure from noble houses was relentless, and the High Sovereign himself declared that refusing the trial would fracture the Empire's unity. So the decision stood. Daniel did not sleep the night before departure, not because he was brave, but because he was human, and humans imagine worst outcomes vividly. He thought about Earth watching, about his family receiving official statements if he failed, about becoming a footnote in diplomatic history. Yet beneath the fear there was something else, a stubborn spark that had defined his species for centuries. Humans were never the strongest predators on their own planet. Yet they survived ice ages, plagues, and wars, not by strength, but by adaptation. And as the transport ship descended through the thick violet clouds of Nareth 9, Daniel forced himself to focus on what he knew best, problem-solving. The moon's surface was darker than expected, the sky tinted deep crimson by distant gas giant light, the air breathable but heavy with metallic scent. Alien observers watched from orbit through drones, but would not interfere unless he died instantly. The trial began the moment his boots touched the ground. A distant roar echoed through the forest, not theatrical, but natural, something large aware of new prey. Daniel quickly assessed his equipment. A compact multi-tool, limited ration packs, a thermal blanket, a small scanning device with restricted range, and a locator beacon that would activate only at extraction time. Nothing more. Within minutes he realized the forest itself was alive with subtle movement, vines retracting slightly when approached, spores releasing faint irritants to test biological response. This was not wilderness. It was curated danger. And then the first predator appeared, tall as a truck with segmented armor plating and luminous eyes that flickered as they calculated motion patterns. Daniel did not run immediately, because running blindly wastes energy. Instead, he activated the scanner briefly, mapping terrain slopes, then retreated toward uneven rocky ground where the creature's heavy frame would lose speed advantage. It charged with terrifying force, claws slicing through thick tree trunks, Daniel barely dodging aside, feeling the wind of its movement brush his shoulder. But instead of attacking, he lured it across a narrow stone ridge he had spotted earlier. The creature's weight cracked the surface, slowing it enough for Daniel to slip down a lower ravine and disappear into mist cover. Hours passed in relentless tension, smaller predators testing him, insect-like drones emerging from soil pits, forcing him to improvise smoke from ration packaging to disrupt their sensors. He learned quickly that the environment rewarded patience and punished panic. By the 12th hour, exhaustion began creeping in, muscles aching, hands shaking slightly. Yet each small survival decision built confidence. And somewhere above, in orbit, alien nobles watched in growing discomfort as the human did not collapse, did not beg, did not freeze in fear. Instead, he adapted, crafting simple noise traps using fallen branches and metallic scraps, redirecting larger predators into each other's territories, exploiting territorial instincts to create temporary safe corridors. At one point, he found an injured creature tangled in vine growth, its aggressive movements weakening. And though killing it would have reduced threat probability, he chose instead to free himself quietly and move away. conserving strength rather than seeking dominance. That choice puzzled observers because Valar warriors were taught to assert superiority whenever possible. But Daniel's goal was survival, not victory. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply, toxic mist thickening near ground level. Daniel climbed into elevated rock formations and wrapped himself in thermal insulation, calculating that predators relying on ground scent would lose track of him temporarily. His body trembled from cold and adrenaline, yet his mind remained active, mapping routes toward the extraction point marked faintly in his scanner's memory. By the second day, sabotage revealed itself. His scanner flickered erratically, showing false terrain data, a malfunction too precise to be random, meaning someone had tampered with equipment before deployment, turning the trial from test into execution attempt. Anger surged briefly, but anger wastes oxygen, so he dismantled the device, rewiring limited circuits using his multi-tool to restore partial function. A risky move, but necessary. When the final hours approached, the largest predator on the moon emerged from dense fog, a massive creature bred specifically for elite combat simulation, its body covered in reinforced plating resistant to standard weapons, its roar vibrating through Daniel's chest, escape paths limited, energy nearly drained. This was the moment many expected him to fail, yet instead of attacking, he studied its movement rhythm, noticing a slight delay when turning left due to asymmetrical plating design. He baited it toward unstable marsh ground previously mapped in broken scanner memory. The creature lunged, heavy mass, breaking surface tension, sinking gradually into adhesive mud, roaring in fury as Daniel moved out of range, not celebrating, not taunting, simply surviving. And when the extraction beacon finally activated, its signal piercing through crimson sky, Daniel stood battered, exhausted, and covered in alien dust, but alive, and as the retrieval ship descended, and orbiting nobles watched in uneasy silence. One truth became impossible to ignore. The human had not proven strength. He had proven something far more unsettling to a rigid empire. He had proven that adaptability could defeat superiority, and that realization was more dangerous to certain political factions than any physical victory. Because empires built on pride do not easily accept lessons taught by those they consider weaker, and as Daniel was lifted back toward the flagship, unaware of the sabotage investigation already unfolding, the trial of worth ended not with death or triumph, but with a shift in perception that would fuel the political storm even further. Daniel expected relief when he returned from Narith 9, but instead he was met with silence that felt heavier than the predators he had escaped. The medical scans confirmed exhaustion, minor injuries, and elevated stress levels. Yet the real danger was no longer physical. It was political, because survival had embarrassed powerful nobles who had quietly hoped the trial would end the problem permanently. And when a proud empire is embarrassed, it does not admit error. It searches for leverage. Within hours of his return, whispers spread through the flagship that new evidence had surfaced suggesting Daniel had manipulated the trial environment through unauthorized signals from Earth, a claim so absurd that even some Valar officers hesitated. Yet the accusation was presented with carefully edited sensor logs showing brief energy spikes near his drop zone, spikes that looked like encrypted transmissions. Daniel knew he had sent nothing. He barely had functioning equipment, but in politics, perception outweighs fact. Lady Valrine confronted the High Council demanding a forensic review, her composure sharp and controlled. Yet beneath it, Daniel sensed growing frustration. Because this was no random suspicion, it was coordinated timing. The accusation emerged precisely when public sympathy toward him had begun rising among younger Valar citizens impressed by his survival. The noble house of Zyrenkale moved quickly, presenting themselves as defenders of imperial integrity, claiming they did not oppose humanity but opposed dishonorable tactics, a clever distinction that framed them as protectors rather than aggressors. Earth intercepted fragments of the accusation through diplomatic channels and reacted with outrage. Military advisors urging precautionary mobilization, which only strengthened the narrative that humans were secretly preparing influence. Daniel found himself confined not as prisoner, but as protected asset, a title that sounded respectful yet functioned like isolation. His communications monitored, his movements restricted, because until the investigation concluded he represented a risk to stability, and stability had become the Empire's highest priority. Late one cycle Lady Veilrine entered his quarters without announcement, dismissing guards with a subtle gesture that showed her authority was still formidable. She told him quietly that independent analysts loyal to her family had discovered tampering inside the trial equipment. Before deployment, micro-adjustments to his scanner that could have led him directly into lethal terrain, meaning someone had attempted to ensure his failure from the start, but revealing this publicly required undeniable proof. Otherwise it would appear as defensive excuse. Daniel felt a cold clarity forming. Because sabotage during the trial and fabricated transmission evidence after survival pointed toward a larger objective, someone wanted not just to break the bond but to discredit humanity permanently, to paint them as deceptive and dangerous, justifying stronger military posture and reinforcing traditional hierarchy. And when power fears change, it often manufactures crisis to prevent it. The conspiracy deepened when a junior Veiler technician secretly requested asylum with Lady Veilrine's faction, claiming he had been ordered to alter sensor logs under direct instruction from Zyron Kale's command network. But before formal testimony could be recorded, the technician disappeared, officially transferred to Outer Fleet assignment, unofficially erased. Tension escalated across both civilizations. Earth media portraying Daniel as victim of alien politics, Veiler conservative networks framing him as cunning manipulator exploiting royal affection. And in the middle of this storm, Daniel realized something painful. He was no longer an individual in their eyes. He was symbol, weapon, proof. Depending on who controlled the narrative, Lady Veilrine faced her own risk, because defending him too aggressively could appear as bias driven by emotional attachment rather than imperial logic. Yet she chose openly to stand beside him during council sessions, declaring before the assembly that if the human were dishonorable, she would accept shared accountability, a statement that shocked even her supporters, because royal blood did not volunteer vulnerability lightly. Zyron Kale responded by accelerating fleet exercises near contested border zones, a move subtle enough to avoid direct accusation, yet provocative enough to force Earth into alert status. And analysts began whispering a darker possibility, that the conspiracy's true aim was not to stop the bond, but to trigger controlled conflict, a limited war that would unify the Empire under traditional leadership and silence reformist voices. If humanity could be blamed for destabilization, expansionist policies would regain support. Daniel saw the pattern forming like a complex machine with too many gears moving at once. And for the first time, he understood that his survival on Nareth 9 had not weakened his enemies. It had forced them to escalate, because adaptability threatens those who rely on rigid systems, and rigid systems often respond by tightening their grip. One evening, as he studied the falsified transmission data, he noticed subtle inconsistencies in energy signatures that only an engineer obsessed with patterns would catch, frequency overlaps that suggested internal ship source rather than external planetary origin, meaning the fake evidence had been generated from within Veiler command infrastructure. He presented the analysis to Lady Veilrine privately, and together they realized exposing the truth required strategic timing. Revealing it too early could allow conspirators to erase deeper trails. Waiting too long risked open conflict. Meanwhile, Zyron Kale publicly proposed an emergency council vote to suspend the bond pending investigation, a move that would not dissolve it, but would freeze humanity's upgraded diplomatic status, effectively isolating Earth and buying time for further manipulation. The vote was scheduled within 2 cycles, and as both fleets repositioned quietly at the edges of contested space, the situation grew dangerously fragile, because if the bond were suspended under suspicion, Earth's trust would fracture, and if Earth mobilized visibly, Veiler hardliners would claim validation. Daniel stood at the center of converging forces, far beyond personal choice. understanding that clearing his name was no longer about pride or romance. It was about preventing a manufactured crisis from igniting real war, and as secret alliances formed in shadowed corridors and encrypted channels pulsed with hidden directives, the hidden conspiracy revealed its most terrifying aspect. It was patient, coordinated, and willing to sacrifice truth to preserve power, leaving Daniel and Lady Veilrine with only one narrowing path forward: expose the deception before the Empire convinced itself that the lie was necessary for survival. By the time the emergency council vote approached, the word war was no longer whispered. It was implied in every fleet movement and every broadcast statement, carefully crafted to avoid direct blame. Valar outer armadas shifted closer to disputed sectors under the justification of routine patrol realignment, while Earth's defense grid expanded its satellite perimeter and activated long-dormant planetary shields. Both sides claiming caution rather than aggression, yet tensions stretched thinner with each passing hour, because once militaries begin moving, stopping them becomes harder than launching them. Xiron Kale's influence had grown stronger within conservative circles, presenting himself as the voice of stability against unpredictable change. His speech is calm and logical, emphasizing that the Empire could not allow emotional decisions to compromise security. And though he never openly accused Lady Veilrine of weakness, the suggestion lingered like smoke. Daniel watched these developments from within restricted quarters, feeling the strange isolation of being the cause, yet having no command authority to fix it. He understood now that conspiracies succeed not only because of lies, but because they exploit fear that already exists. And fear among the Valar was ancient. Fear of stagnation, fear of decline, fear that strength might fade if traditions bent too far. Lady Veilrine refused to retreat from the public stage, instead requesting permission to address the full High Sovereign Assembly before the vote, a rare right rarely invoked outside of succession disputes. Her request alone shocked observers, because it signaled willingness to confront not only noble houses, but the Empire's deepest insecurities. On the day of the assembly, the Grand Chamber was filled beyond capacity, live transmissions spreading across both civilizations. Daniel stood beside her not as decoration, but as declared partner, his presence itself controversial, whispers echoing as he walked through towering columns of glowing stone. And as the sovereign entered, silence settled like a blade lowered between factions. Veilrine began her speech not with defense, but with history, reminding the Empire of moments when inflexibility had nearly cost them survival. Wars avoided because unexpected alliances were formed, crises solved because someone dared to step beyond tradition. She did not romanticize her bond with Daniel. She framed it as strategic evolution, an acknowledgement that humanity's adaptability was not weakness, but resource. And then she revealed partial evidence of equipment sabotage and falsified transmissions, careful not to accuse directly, but enough to plant doubt in the certainty Xiron Kale had cultivated. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Yet before momentum could fully shift, Xiron himself stepped forward requesting immediate cross-examination, his voice steady as steel, accusing the human of exploiting internal division to elevate Earth's position. And in that charged moment, he ordered fleet status updates displayed across the chamber screens, revealing how close both militaries had come to confrontation. The implication clear: this bond was destabilizing the balance of power. Daniel felt something inside him tighten, because he saw the trap clearly now. If he remained silent, the narrative would solidify around manipulation and risk. If he spoke poorly, he could confirm their fears. And so he did something unexpected. He requested permission to address the sovereign directly, not as royal consort, but as human citizen. The chamber hesitated before granting it, and when he spoke, his voice was not grand or poetic. It was simple, steady, honest. He admitted that his first words had been a joke born from nervous tension, that he had never intended to disrupt an empire. But he also admitted that since that moment, he had seen something in the Valar that reminded him of humanity's own past, strength so focused on control that it feared vulnerability. He told them that humans survived not by denying weakness, but by cooperating despite it. That war would not prove superiority, but confirm insecurity. And that if his existence truly threatened the Empire, then perhaps the Empire was not as stable as it believed. The simplicity of his words carried weight precisely because they lacked strategy. He was not trying to win power. He was trying to prevent death. And then the chamber alarms shifted tone abruptly. An alert from border sectors indicating unauthorized weapons lock sequences between forward scout ships. Someone had triggered engagement protocols without council approval. Panic surged through observers as fleet commanders scrambled to confirm control codes. Zyron's expression flickered for the first time. Not fear, but calculation disrupted. Because if open conflict began during the assembly, it would validate every claim of instability. Lady Veilrine moved instantly, accessing command. Authority to freeze certain fleet chains. Her voice commanding yet controlled. While Daniel watched screens showing how close missile platforms had come to activation, mere seconds from automated retaliation, and in that narrow window before chaos erupted, the Sovereign himself issued a direct override across all Imperial channels, halting the escalation, an action rarely taken and never lightly. Silence returned slowly, heavier than before, because everyone understood how near they had come to disaster. And in that suspended stillness, the conspiracy's objective became visible to even neutral observers. The manufactured tension had almost succeeded in igniting a limited war that would have justified emergency powers and consolidated traditional authority. But instead, the exposure of sabotage evidence combined with near catastrophe shifted perception. Doubts about Zyron's narrative spreading quietly. Not as open accusation, but as cautious reevaluation. The Sovereign postponed the vote, indefinitely pending full investigation, effectively denying the conspirators immediate victory. Yet the danger was not over. Fleets remained positioned, trust remained fragile, and as the assembly dissolved into controlled but tense departure, Daniel understood that surviving predators on a hostile moon had been simpler than navigating empires on the brink of self-destruction. Because war at the edge is rarely caused by strength alone, it is triggered by fear disguised as protection. And, though immediate conflict had been avoided, the balance between reform and rigidity now stood exposed under the harsh light of near catastrophe, leaving the final outcome uncertain, suspended between those who sought evolution and those who would risk everything to prevent it. The days following the near war did not bring celebration. They brought a strange and careful quiet, the kind that comes after two armies lower their weapons, but keep their fingers close to the triggers. The High Sovereign ordered a full internal investigation into fleet override attempts and falsified trial data, and though no public accusation named Zyron Kale directly, his influence began to shrink as more command officers hesitated to align themselves with a faction that had almost pushed the Empire into uncontrolled conflict. Several mid-level commanders quietly shifted loyalty toward reformist voices, not out of love for humanity, but out of fear of reckless instability. Earth also adjusted its posture, lowering visible defensive readiness in a calculated gesture of trust, and that small move carried more diplomatic weight than speeches, because restraint in the face of tension signaled confidence rather than weakness. Daniel observed all of this from a new position within the flagship, no longer confined but not entirely free either, his status evolving into something undefined. And in private conversations, Lady Veilrine admitted that the conspiracy had not been fully dismantled, only exposed enough to slow its advance. Power structures centuries old do not collapse in a week. They adapt, retreat, and wait. Yet something fundamental had shifted. Younger Valar citizens began openly discussing humanity not as inferior, but as instructive, debating adaptability as strength rather than flaw. And for the first time in generations, the Empire faced the idea that change might not mean decay. As the investigation concluded weeks later, the High Sovereign announced formal charges against several command officials involved in data manipulation and unauthorized fleet commands. The evidence undeniable once internal systems were audited thoroughly. Kale was not executed or exiled, because empires rarely eliminate powerful figures openly without risking fracture, but he was stripped of operational authority and reassigned under heavy supervision. A political defeat disguised as administrative correction, and though he bowed publicly to the decision, his eyes held the cold promise of unfinished ambition. The immediate threat of war faded, replaced by a tense recalibration of influence. And within this fragile new balance, the question of the bond resurfaced, not as crisis, but as choice. The sovereign summoned Daniel and Valrine to the grand chamber once more, this time not under pressure, but under observation. And before the entire assembly, the sovereign acknowledged that the human had survived the trial of worth without dishonor, had faced accusation without retaliation, and had spoken before the empire without manipulation, traits the sovereign described as rare even among Vela nobility. The bond, therefore, would stand not as political experiment, but as sovereign recognized alliance between species. Yet final confirmation required a second ceremony, not of declaration, but of mutual vow. Because in Valar tradition, true bonds required a quality of gesture. Daniel understood immediately what that meant. Weeks earlier, she had bowed before him alone. Now the Empire expected visible reciprocity, and on the day of the ceremony, the chamber felt different from the first gathering, less tense yet more attentive. Because this time, both civilizations knew the stakes and the cost of miscalculation. Earth's leaders watched closely but did not interfere, trusting Daniel to act not as politician, but as human. Lady Valrine stepped forward in ceremonial armor lighter than her battle attire, symbols of her house glowing softly across silver fabric. And she did not kneel first this time. She stood still, waiting, because equality cannot be commanded. It must be chosen. Daniel felt the weight of history pressing again. But it was no longer crushing. It was clarifying. He understood that bowing would not make humanity smaller. It would show that strength and humility could exist together. That partnership did not erase identity. And so before the eyes of an interstellar empire, a human engineer who once made a careless joke lowered himself to one knee, head bowed with steady intention, not out of submission but respect, and for several heartbeats no one moved, the symbolism cutting deeper than speeches ever could. Because humans did not bow easily, and Valar royalty did not wait patiently. Yet here they stood, equal in gesture. Lady Valrine then mirrored him, lowering herself so that both knelt facing each other, a position unprecedented in imperial record. And when they rose together, the chamber did not erupt in noise, but in something quieter and more powerful. Acceptance, not universal or perfect, but real enough to hold. The sovereign declared the bond complete under mutual recognition, establishing humanity as allied sovereign partner rather than subordinate client state. Fleets adjusted their positions not as warning, but as shared patrol formations. Research channels opened cautiously between civilizations, and though suspicions still lingered in darker corridors of power, the immediate edge of war had receded. Later, in a private observation deck overlooking Earth's blue curve against black space, Valrine asked Daniel the question that had remained unspoken since the beginning. Whether his words that first day had truly been only a joke. He smiled slightly, admitting they had been born from nervous humor, but everything since had transformed them into something deliberate. He did not understand every part of her empire, and she did not understand every part of humanity. Yet both had chosen to stand rather than retreat when fear demanded it, and that choice mattered more than the accident that started it all. As stars reflected in the transparent hull, and two species recalculated their futures, Daniel realized that strength was not measured only in fleets or weapons or ancient law. Sometimes it was measured in the courage to adapt, to admit error, to bow without surrendering identity. And somewhere deep within an empire built on pride, a new idea had taken root, that evolution was not betrayal, that vulnerability could coexist with power, and that a single human joke had not weakened the galaxy. It had forced it to grow, leaving the future unwritten but no longer balanced on the edge of destruction, instead suspended in possibility, where Partnership might succeed, not because it was easy, but because both sides had survived the storm and chosen not to let fear define them.